welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons' Hall, Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Chanté, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. History has a way of humbling even its most powerful figures. In Victorian Britain, a quiet disease moved freely through drawing rooms and corridors of power. It spared no one, not aristocrats, not politicians. One of those men was Lord Randolph Churchill, a rising political star, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and father of a future Prime Minister. His fall did not come through scandal or defeat, but through disease. At its height, syphilis was so widespread that as many as 1 in 5 people in London may have carried it. Long before antibiotics, it reshaped minds, lives, and legacies. One of its most devastating late-stage effects was general paralysis of the insane, or GPI, a condition caused by syphilis reaching the brain, blurring the line between illness and madness. In this episode of Beyond the Knife, Andy Ellis, author and emeritus professor at the University of York, joins us to explore how GPI shaped the final years of Lord Randolph Churchill's life and what it reveals about medicine, power, and denial in the 19th century. Andy, welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to start with a question that we put to all of those who join us. If you could be present at any moment in the history of medicine, what would it be and why?
Well, the date I've chosen is not a famous one in the history of medicine, but it's one with a strong personal resonance. On Saturday, the 16th of April, 1864, my great-great-grandfather, John Ellis, was diagnosed with general paralysis by Dr. W.P. Ruddock of Wakefield in Yorkshire. John was one of several black sheep in the family, possibly the blackest. He was vain, he was hard drinking, he was hard swearing. He worked as a cart driver in inner-city Leeds, and he spent what he earned on alcohol and clothes while neglecting his wife and his children. Prior to his diagnosis, he had spent 6 months making a nuisance of himself in the slums of Leeds, walking around complaining that he was about to be hung or shot. The attention was drawn to a man called John Hartley, the local relieving officer, whose job it was to organise medical and financial assistance for the poor and arrange appropriate care for men and women with severe mental illness. So Mr. Hartley took my great-great-grandfather to the West Riding Lunatic Asylum on the outskirts of Wakefield, where he was assessed and admitted. His medical notes show that he had paranoia, a wild and unsettled manner, and a slight tremulousness in his speech. These were classic symptoms of general paralysis. And he was diagnosed as showing symptoms of general paralysis, and he was one of 42 patients with that condition in the Wakefield Asylum in 1864. He was 40 years old. The name West Riding Lunatic Asylum conjures up awful images of the kind of conditions in which some patients with mental illness were held, particularly in the 18th century. But in fact, it was a model of humane treatment run by a man called James Crichton Browne, who was an Edinburgh-born psychiatrist who was completely dedicated to humane treatment of the mentally ill. And the term asylum back in those days was used in the sense that we now use the term political asylum. It was a place of safety and refuge for people like John Ellis. So he was well fed, given clean bedding and clothes, and jobs in the asylum kitchen, the small farm that generated food for the patients and the staff, and he was rewarded with a daily ration of beer and the occasional tot of rum, which was his favourite. He lived a remarkable 12 years. Most people with general paralysis died within a year or two of diagnosis. He lived 12 years, which is not unprecedented, but quite uncommon. But on the 25th of April, 1876, he had died at the age of 52. And James Crichton Browne, who was committed to humane treatment of the mentally ill, was also committed to research into mental illness. And one of the things he did was institute a program of post-mortem analysis of the brains of people who died with mental illness. He was hoping to find correlations between the nature of the damage that their brains had suffered and the symptoms that they had shown during life. So, not many people know the weight of the brain of their great-great-grandfather when he died, but I do. It weighed 1,397 grams, which is about 3 pounds, 1 ounce, and it was in a very sorry state indeed. Atrophied, degenerated, with lots of fluid in there, typical of general paralysis. So, I should say that I'm not a historian, I'm not a medical historian. I spent my academic career doing human neuropsychology, studying the effects of brain damage on psychological functions like language, memory, and face recognition. And the people I worked with mostly had brain tumours, dementia, or strokes. I didn't encounter a single person with general paralysis during 35 years of working as a neuropsychologist because that condition is now very rare. But the study of general paralysis, and particularly the link to my great-great-grandfather, seemed like an ideal thing to study in my retirement, which is how I came across Lord Randolph Churchill.
What a great answer to the question. That is such a remarkable story. Thank you for sharing it with us and trusting it with us too. It's really striking how a single family date opens up this huge amount of information. Mental illness, humane care, a moment when medicine is genuinely trying to understand the brain. And the way you tell the story, I think your great-great-grandfather very quickly becomes a person rather than a diagnosis. And it's such a great point, the word West Riding, or the name West Riding Asylum, for me it conjures up this idea of this terrible place. And it's interesting to challenge those assumptions that I think probably come from the Victorian times.
Well, from about 1810, 1828 onwards, a number of asylums were created around the UK dedicated to humane treatment. There are various motivations for that, one of which I'll come on to in a moment. But another was the distress at the treatment of King George III. People thought, he'd been given an appalling treatment and that people with mental illness ought to be treated better. And so you had Lancaster, you had York, you had asylums in Leeds and in Scotland, one at Dumfries, where James Crichton Browne's father worked, all dedicated to humane treatment.
And it feels so fitting as well that your own career and your interest in neuropsychology is what has led you back to a condition that's almost disappeared.
Yes, indeed. And it's enabled me to understand, to read some of the 19th century literature and make some sense of it. And again, I'll come on to this a bit later, but to read the very few modern studies of general paralysis that have been done on patients who have developed that condition using things like brain imaging and genetic analysis. So my background has been very helpful, and this has been an absolutely fascinating project.
Let's start there then. What exactly was general paralysis? Why was it such a defining diagnosis of the 19th century?
General paralysis came out of nowhere. It was first observed in the early 1800s, 1800 to 1810, in Paris, by doctors who swore they had never seen anything like it. Particularly two men, one called Philippe Pinel and the other called Jean-Étienne Esquirol, excuse my French, who were psychiatrists appointed by the post-revolutionary establishment in Paris to reform the asylums there, the hospitals, and the patients they observed were mostly former soldiers who had served in Napoleon's army. And they observed that these patients showed two broad sets of symptoms. The first they call mental, which include things like paranoia, rapid mood swings, delusions of grandeur, and dementia. And the other symptoms were what they called physical, things like trembling tongue and lips, slurred articulation, temporary paralyses of the arms and legs, loss of sensation. The textbooks of the time loved quoting the grandiose delusions, things like patients believing they were Napoleon Bonaparte, or the richest man in the world, or possessed of superhuman powers. And there are lots of examples like this if you look at the 19th century textbooks. But Pinel and Esquirol set in place a program of research into general paralysis, they recruited a sequence of remarkably talented young trainees who they set to work doing anatomical and clinical work. And they also sent them off to the archives and the ancient Greek and Latin and Egyptian texts, looking for descriptions of patients with things like general paralysis, with anything like general paralysis, because they believed that the world had been created in 7 days, including all the diseases that people are subject to. And so it was incomprehensible to them that a disease could come out of nowhere during their own lifetimes and become so prevalent. But try as they might, their trainees couldn't find anything remotely resembling general paralysis in the older literature. The other thing they did were very, very careful clinical and anatomical studies of the condition. And one of the things they observed was degeneration of the meninges, the thin membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord. And they thought that that degeneration lay at the root, the origins, particularly of the physical symptoms, because they were what we call dualists. They thought that mind and matter were completely separate things. And so for them, the physical symptoms like trembling tongues and paralyzed limbs were afflictions of the brain and nervous system that belonged in the world of matter, whereas delusions and paranoia belonged in the world of the mind or the soul. And they couldn't contemplate a disease that would affect both the mind and the body at the same time. So they came to the conclusion that general paralysis was actually two diseases in one. The physical symptoms they blamed on degeneration of the meninges and the brain and the spinal cord, while the mental symptoms they attributed to moral causes, things like grief, overwork, or excess of ambition. And that dualism set the study of general paralysis back some considerable time, and it took a while for it to recover in a sense. Meanwhile, a general paralysis spread gradually across Europe. It was established in England by the 1820s. It was first observed in Scotland in 1839 by the father of James Crichton Browne, and it was first reported in America in 1843. Some notable victims included Beau Brummel, who we might nowadays describe as a fashion influencer. He was the man who told other men how to dress and present themselves. The Italian opera composer Gaetano Donizetti. Vincent van Gogh's brother, Theo, suffered from general paralysis. Lord Randolph Churchill. Coming into the 20th century, African-American ragtime composer Scott Joplin and Chicago mobster Al Capone died of general paralysis. A mobster with general paralysis is probably a man you want to steer clear of.
Absolutely. The Netflix series right there, huh?
Yeah. The first three victims, Brummel, Donizetti, and Theo van Gogh, were all interestingly treated by doctors who had trained in Paris with Pinel and Esquirol. So all the pupils they treated took over the asylums throughout France, converted them into humane institutions, and knew general paralysis when they saw it. And it was that spread of the humane treatment movement that was partly the reason why Wakefield Asylum was what it was when John Ellis was admitted there.
It's incredible. I think what's so striking is that general paralysis appears as medicine's beginning to be forced to rethink both mental illness and humane care. And that spread then steadily across Europe and beyond. And that affects everyone, right? Anonymous asylum patients, well-known figures. It's not selective. It's phenomenal. And of course, you mention Lord Randolph Churchill, who is far less familiar to most people than his son. He certainly was to me until I met you. So before we go any further, tell us, who was Lord Randolph Churchill and why his illness matters in this story?
He was Sir Winston Churchill's father. He was born in 1849, the second son of the Duke of Marlborough, who owned Blenheim Palace, which is a vast pile at Woodstock near Oxford, so huge and sprawling that the family struggled to maintain it. Lord Randolph was the second son. He was educated at Eton and Oxford, and at Oxford he rapidly acquired a reputation for rowdiness and general entitlement. His father said that Randolph's, this is a nice quote, great faults are want of self-control in his language, temper and demeanour, and an imperiousness of disposition to those under him. And Lord Randolph's friend Lord Rosebery described him as brilliant, courageous, resourceful, and unembarrassed by scruple.
I really like unembarrassed by scruple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of hope some might describe me like that one day.
Lord Randolph at Oxford was a member of the infamous Bullingdon Club, which was a student dining and drinking society that has been home to other future Conservative politicians in more recent times. And I leave it to listeners to decide whether unembarrassed by scruple could possibly apply to any of them. In 1873, he met Miss Jenny Jerome, who was the daughter of a wealthy American family. Lord Randolph's parents thought she was too nouveau riche, but her parents thought she could do better than marry a second son who wasn't scheduled to inherit Blenheim Palace. Anyway, the two of them married, and Winston was born in November of 1874. Lord Randolph became a Conservative Member of Parliament for Woodstock. He was an energetic, if troublesome, parliamentarian and a particularly witty speechmaker who loved laying into both members of the opposition and members of his own party. I think in an attempt to force him to show some degree of responsibility, he was made Secretary of State for India, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and leader of the House of Commons, none of which had any effect on his general behaviour. He threatened to resign over proposed cuts to Army and Navy funding. He expected his resignation to be refused, but it was accepted. His party leaders had had enough of him, and his political career in 1886 was effectively over.
Oh, I love that. It felt like, well, that's it, I'll resign. And everyone goes, sure, what a shock that must have been, huh? So given how flamboyant he is, how competitive he is, how did the early symptoms of general paralysis show themselves? And at what point did it become clear to him or those around him that this was more than just a temperament or political recklessness?
It's a good question, given the nature of his character, but the early 1890s, when he was in his early 40s, he began to show rapid mood swings, exceptionally angry outbursts. He had episodes of dizziness, which patients with general paralysis could develop, and numbness in his hands and difficulty in walking. And his articulation became particularly poor. So he was described when he tried to speak in the House of Commons. One account said that members were horrified in Churchill's appearance. His white and prematurely aged face, shaking hands, and dreadful articulation were too much for many, who quietly slipped out of the house. A year or two later, his tongue and lips were shown to be trembling, which was a very characteristic condition that he hadn't shown before. Lady Jenny approached the family physician, who suggested that she should consult a leading neurologist called Thomas Buzzard, which she did, who I think tipped her off to the fact that her husband might be developing general paralysis. Lord Randolph was furious when he found out that his wife had visited a neurologist, and he wrote Dr. Buzzard saying that he had hardly ever had numbness or difficulty of articulation, which was an implicit admission that he had indeed suffered both of those symptoms. In 1894, he lost his self-control completely during a debate in Parliament, screaming abuse at members of his own benches. His speeches became halting and forgetful, with long pauses. And a friend of his described him as terribly altered, poor fellow, having some disease, paralysis, I suppose, which affects his speech so that it is painful to listen to him. Interesting, he had no insight whatsoever. He thought his speeches were witty and articulate and as clever as ever.
1884, and he resigned in 1886, was it?
In 1886, he resigned, but he continued being a member of Parliament.
2 years of being in a powerful position with those effects happening, probably coming on slowly, right?
Yeah, it really seems to have taken hold in the early 1890s after he had been dropped by the Conservative Party. His doctors prescribed rest, which he interpreted as needing to take a world tour.
Of course.
Of course, with his wife, poor Lady Jenny, a bunch of servants, and a young doctor that he could dominate and ignore. They went to America, up to Canada, across Canada, sailed to Japan, to Malaysia, Singapore, and India. And during that trip, his condition got worse and worse. He had episodes of numbness and weakness in his hand. He was often highly excitable. His walking was staggering and uncertain. When they were in Malaysia, he was showing delusions most days. Unfortunately, the content of those delusions hasn't been reported or wasn't reported, so we don't know exactly what they were. There were episodes of paralysis affecting his lower lip and jaw, and he was getting weaker and weaker and less controllable. So they decided to bring him home. And when they brought him home, he was mostly in a coma, but he arrived in London shortly before Christmas of 1894, when Winston saw him and described him as being as weak and helpless in mind and body as a little child.
Gosh.
He died not long after, on 24th of January 1895, 45 years old. Lady Jenny and young Winston were present when he passed. He'd been ill for some time, so the newspapers had chance to prepare their obituaries.
Mm-hmm.
And a major obituary appeared in the Times. It ran over 7 columns, observing that the disease from which he suffered, general paralysis, had first seized him 2 or 3 years ago. It probably went a bit further than that, and noted that the diagnosis of general paralysis had been agreed by 3 of London's leading neurologists, Thomas Buzzard, William Gowers, and Sir John Russell Reynolds. That was about as distinguished and experienced as a trio as you could possibly assemble. The Times obituary incorporated an extract from the Lancet, which attributed Lord Randolph's general paralysis to his having led an overfull life in every direction, resulting in a ruined nervous constitution.
Gosh, what a thought, huh?
Yeah, so they were blaming overwork and thwarted ambition. Indeed, his general paralysis was a consequence of the way he had dedicated himself to political life and to the country, and was nothing to be ashamed of. And the way that the Times and the Lancet used the term general paralysis makes it very clear that they expected readers to be familiar with that disease, as if they'd talked about measles or chickenpox. And indeed, readers would have been, because by the 1890s, general paralysis had spread across the globe and had killed many thousands of people. It remained progressive and almost invariably fatal, and was a much feared disease. So that as soon as diagnosis was assigned, you knew what you were in for. And doctors said that their role was primarily to tell the patient to get their affairs in order and to tell the family what was going to happen over the coming years.
Wow, that's amazing. So, I mean, it's just fascinating that by the time of his death, general paralysis is openly named by doctors, widely understood by the public, yet explained in moral terms like overwork and ambition. So we hark back to earlier when you're talking about this duality of the disease.
Well, it was on the cusp of changing. In fact, way back in 1857, 2 little-known doctors called Friedrich von Esmark and Peter Villiers Jessen proposed that general paralysis was actually caused by chronic infection with the sexually transmitted disease syphilis, which was extremely common at the time. The problem was that Jessen was a little-known psychiatrist, while Esmark's reputation was in battlefield medicine. He developed various devices for treating injuries and bone breaks and the like on the battlefield. That was his specialism. The pair of them published a paper describing 3 patients with general paralysis, but they admitted that their evidence was weak, and in only one of them was syphilis well documented. But they thought it was worth putting that possibility out there. They were largely ignored, almost universally ignored by the medical establishment in Europe and America, who dismissed them. But evidence began to accumulate gradually, and until the early 1900s, so not long after Lord Randolph died, a very eminent German psychiatrist called Emil Kraepelin assembled the arguments for and against the syphilis hypothesis. He acknowledged that the evidence wasn't conclusive, but he lent his weight to the view that chronic infection with syphilis was the most likely cause of general paralysis, not moral causes.
Wow, that's quite a moment, right?
It was quite a moment, yeah. It had long been assumed that syphilis was a bacterial disease, but the bacterium responsible had proved very elusive. It was, however, identified in 1905 and christened Treponema pallidum. It's extremely thin, it's shaped like a coiled spring, and it's very hard to see with a conventional microscope, which was one reason why it took so long to identify it. But once that discovery had been made, then it was assumed that that bacterium should be found in the brains of patients with general paralysis, if paralysis was indeed caused by syphilis. And in 1913, a Japanese microbiologist working in America called Hideo Noguchi found Treponema pallidum in samples taken at post-mortem from the brains of patients who had recently died from general paralysis. And his discovery was quickly replicated by other medical researchers, including James McIntosh and Paul Fildes in London, who used material sent from the asylum in Wakefield.
Wow, that's incredible. What did that feel like when you read that?
I thought it was delightful that Wakefield was still treating and studying general paralysis in about 1915, we're talking about now.
Gosh.
But once that discovery had been made and replicated, there could no longer be any dispute that syphilis caused general paralysis. This led to the development of new tests and new treatments, including malaria therapy, where doctors would deliberately infect or inoculate patients with malaria. So hospitals across Europe kept supplies of mosquitoes that they used to infect patients, whereas American doctors favored taking tissue from patients with malaria and using it to inoculate general paralysis sufferers. The goal was to get the general paralysis patients to have 6 or 7 bouts of fever, with the aim that the raised temperatures would kill off the bacteria. And the trick was to get the temperature high enough to kill the bacteria without killing the patients.
Extraordinary. All the ways we've tried to heal ourselves.
Yeah, and it was very, very widely used for a while, malaria therapy, and it worked. If it was done well and well controlled, it couldn't reverse general paralysis, but it could kill off the bacteria and stop the progression of the disease in its tracks.
Gosh.
So it worked best if it was done immediately after diagnosis. You could halt the progression and the patient would have relatively mild symptoms. But it was risky and the death rate was high. And when penicillin was discovered in the late 1920s, it proved to be effective first against syphilis and was used to treat battlefield troops and troops in World War II. But it was also shown to be effective against general paralysis in that it could halt the progression of the disease. It couldn't reverse it, but it could halt it. And Al Capone is believed to have been one of the very first general paralysis patients to be given both penicillin and malaria therapy. He was given malaria therapy while he was in Alcatraz, and after he was released, he was given penicillin too. But his general paralysis was too advanced, and that treatment came too late for him. He died shortly after. Fortunately, syphilis has not acquired a resistance to penicillin, which remains the basis for modern treatment and is the main reason why syphilis seldom progresses to general paralysis nowadays, and is why general paralysis is rare today.
I have to confess, at Surgeons Hall, due to the kind of history we have, the collections that are here, we talk about syphilis a lot. We talk about STDs a lot because we have collections that physically show the impacts of them. And hurrah for penicillin, right? Centuries of people suffering from this bacteria. It's just extraordinary to me. So this is the moment that you described, really, when that moral explanation finally gives way to a biological one. So once syphilis is identified as the cause of general paralysis, and especially after that bacterium is found in the brain, it changes everywhere. Everything. So diagnosis, treatment, but also how we look back at those earlier cases. So with that in mind, does it force us to re-examine figures like Lord Randolph Churchill? So are there clues in his earlier life that point towards syphilis before the neurological symptoms appeared?
Yes, indeed. And several of those early cases, Beau Brummel, for example, Theo van Gogh, had syphilis, and it is known, but the connection between that and their later general paralysis wasn't understood. Al Capone had syphilis. Lord Randolph himself showed symptoms attributable to syphilis, particularly a bout of partial deafness and dizziness and other conditions, and his family and friends accepted that he had syphilis and debated when it might have been acquired. So one friend thought he'd caught it after a raucous evening with the Bullingdon Club, whereas members of Lady Jenny's family thought he'd contracted it from a chambermaid at Blenheim Palace shortly.
All I can imagine is a dinner party where this debate is happening, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He had a friend called Julian Osgood Field who took him to a specialist syphilologist. There were such people in Paris. They called themselves specialists in skin diseases because a skin rash was one of the symptoms of syphilis, and it was easier to be seen walking through the door of a specialist in skin diseases than somebody with syphilologist on their brass plate.
Fair enough.
The Field took Lord Randolph to see this specialist in Paris, who recommended a course of treatment which would have been mercury-based, given the time, and mercury-based treatments had unpleasant side effects of their own. Your teeth dropped out, your hair tended to drop out, your skin became white and grey, so it was very obvious what treatment you were on, and therefore what disease you had. And on more than one occasion, Lord Randolph was prescribed these medications, but threw them away and refused to take them. And the rare modern cases that are seen nowadays are often people who have refused to take medication for their early syphilis. Swinton himself accepted that his father had syphilis. He told his private secretary that his father's symptoms were the child of syphilis. And he must have read that obituary in the Times and the Lancet, where general paralysis is spelled out explicitly. So he must have known what his father had died of. But he didn't make a big thing of it, unlike Boris Johnson, who in his book on Sir Winston said that Lord Randolph died in political isolation and syphilitic despair.
Wow.
A good Johnsonian turn of phrase.
Absolutely.
If the Times and the Lancet had known in 1895 what was known in 1913 and 1920, namely that general paralysis was caused by syphilis, there is no way they would even have named the cause of Lord Randolph's death. I'm sure they would have blamed it on the heart problems that he had, and they wouldn't have trumpeted it as evidence of his dedication and commitment to the country.
Yeah.
They thought it was moral.
Yeah, they thought it was moral. So once you start to look at it through the knowledge, through the lens of knowledge that we have now, the signs line up pretty well. So we've got deafness, vertigo, gait problems. Now, I understand people still dispute the diagnosis when it comes to Lord Randolph. Well, that the general paralysis was caused by syphilis, that is. Why do those arguments still exist?
There have been historians and others who I think are so enamoured of Sir Winston Churchill.
Right.
They're members of the International Churchill Society, and I think they just couldn't believe that their hero's father had died from syphilis. And so some of them have gone to great lengths to try to give other explanations of Lord Randolph's condition. Things like exhaustion, high blood pressure, heavy smoking, hearing difficulties, and a brain tumour. But I looked at those explanations and tried to compare them against Lord Randolph's symptoms in an article I did for Finest Hour, which is the online publication of the International Churchill Society. And there are various problems, one of which is that the alternative explanations fail to address some of his symptoms, like the tremulous tongue and lips and the delusions, which were common features of general paralysis, but can't be explained in terms of high blood pressure, exhaustion, heavy smoking, etc., or even a brain tumor. So I think that they persuaded themselves that Lord Randolph hadn't been syphilitic, partly by ignoring the symptoms that he showed and ignoring the fact that London's three most prominent neurologists had agreed on the diagnosis of general paralysis, which is what the modern historians disputed. And these were people who knew the condition inside out and had examined Lord Randolph during his illness.
It's so interesting, isn't it? When we share histories, there tends to be a desire to always see certain people as a hero or as this kind of perfect, flawless man with very few faults who could overcome massive problems. And I don't think I've found a single person who meets that, right? Man or woman. It's interesting working in the college because often when we share histories or stories about people from the past, if they're people that were really loved or really well known, if those stories, I don't know, might share something negative, there are people who will get upset with us for sharing those stories. But what's interesting here is that Winston Churchill himself accepted that his father had syphilis.
Yes, and the modern generation of the Churchill family are also reconciled to this.
Yeah.
They didn't take exception to what I said in that online article, and because the editor obviously approached them and said, are you comfortable with this? And they said, yes, it's true.
Yeah, okay. Oh, I wondered if you'd had any response. But when we think about the disease in recent times, is there anything to learn that we can add to our knowledge now when we think about recent cases?
Yes, recent cases do happen, mostly among people whose syphilis is either inadequately treated or they refuse treatment. One of the things with syphilis is when the early skin rash has disappeared, they often enter what's called a latent period, which can last several years and be relatively symptom-free, and they think that they have recovered from it. And then they are hit by general paralysis or other tertiary conditions, which show that it's been lingering in their bodies all that time. One of the arguments that was raised against syphilis as a cause of general paralysis was that an awful lot of people had syphilis and very few of them developed general paralysis.
Right, okay.
How could that be? And another argument was that syphilis had been around for hundreds of years before general paralysis was first observed in the early 1800s. Again, where was general paralysis during those centuries? It didn't seem to make sense, and these were reasonable objections. And an important clue came when Kraepelin suggested that it may have been a new strain of the syphilis bacterium, a virus he called it, that arose probably in the 1790s, giving rise to patients in the early 1800s. And modern genetic techniques have shown that there are many different strains of Treponema pallidum in circulation at any one time. A few of them are particularly prevalent in patients with tertiary neurosyphilis, which is what we nowadays call the effects of syphilis on the central nervous system. So if one of those strains arose in the late 18th century, it would explain the sudden emergence, apparently out of nowhere, of general paralysis in the early 1800s.
Gosh, that's terrifying. So it's evolving, it's changing.
They do. I mean, we know from the recent history of viruses, they're evolving all the time and changing. Other strains of T. pallidum remain in circulation, but only people infected with those particular strains are at risk of developing general paralysis, which would explain why only a minority of people with syphilis ever went on to develop general paralysis. They were the unlucky ones who contracted one of those strains. When the first brain scanners became available in the 1970s, studies were done of patients with general paralysis. And I think one of the best was a study by Mimura and colleagues in 1977. Their patient was a Japanese woman who had been infected with syphilis by her errant husband, but had not sought treatment at the time, whether through shame or what, I'm not sure. She developed general paralysis and was given an MRI scan that found atrophy, withering, in her frontal and temporal lobes, and shrinking of structures particularly involved in memory, the hippocampi. They gave her a second type of scan that looked at blood flow and showed that it was reduced in her frontal and temporal regions. And those were exactly the areas where T. pallidum had been found in the brains of general paralysis patients. So there's a nice tie in there. Additionally, Mimura and colleagues gave their patient 3 weeks of intravenous penicillin and noted increased blood flow in the temporal and frontal regions that correlated with improved performance on psychological and behavioral tests. So it was an early study of neuroimaging, but it was ahead of its time and remarkable in the way that they studied both the reasons for disorder and the effects of penicillin. One of the regions of the brain in the frontal areas is called the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it has been associated with lack of impulse control, so rage, the kind of things that Lord Randolph showed, and with delusions.
Lack of scruples.
Yes, lack of scruples, grandiose delusions, you name it. So there's a nice coming together of the neuroscience and the clinical presentation of these patients. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is whether there's any possibility that general paralysis might one day re-emerge as a major condition as it was in Lord Randolph's time. Syphilis is on the increase globally, including in Europe and the US, and this is thought to be due to fewer people taking precautions to avoid initial infection. Fortunately for us, penicillin-based medication remains effective. It works against primary syphilis, preventing the progression to general paralysis and other conditions, and long may it continue to be effective, because if the bacterium ever developed a resistance to penicillin and other antibiotics, general paralysis could start to re-emerge, because syphilis could start to invade the central nervous system once again. Another thought that rather frightens me is that gullible people might be turned against antibiotics by the kind of influencers and politicians that are now telling people that certain forms of medication are harmful or unnecessary. If that happened, and if enough people started to refuse antibiotics again, their syphilis could turn into general paralysis, and we might start seeing it in our midst again. People would start to show tremulous tongues, their speech would become blurred, their limbs would become weak and numb, they'd show paranoia and delusions of grandeur, just like my great-great-grandfather.
Oh, Andy, I think that's why it's so important that we make podcasts like this and that we publish information like this, right?
Yes, indeed.
I do share that fear, though, that idea that we might turn away from using medication that we know works or listening to science. I mean, that's horrifying. It feels like quite a sobering but important moment to end on. So while general paralysis may be rare today, the conditions that once allowed it to flourish haven't disappeared entirely. And yeah, history has a great way of reminding us not to be complacent.
The conditions that allowed it to flourish are on the increase, which is particularly why we mustn't be complacent and why people need to take the medications that prevent it.
Oh, absolutely. Andy, thank you so much for guiding us through such a powerful mix of personal history, medical science, social change, and for showing us how much there is still to learn when we really look carefully at the past.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk. You can also follow us on our social media channels. Join us wherever you get your podcasts.